Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is December 15th, 2023. And let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So today I'm going to go into the map updates and then a few news updates as well. And again, I usually start with Avdiivka, so let's get to Avdiivka first. And unfortunately, the Russians continue on pressing forward, and they have some small successes and gains in the northern direction specifically. Again, Stepove, Krasnohorivka, and south of Krasnohorivka, the Russians are pushing in these three directions. So towards Stepove, towards Avdiivka, and in the north towards Keramik and Novokalinove. So there's three pushes from the Russians right now. And as you can see, last few days, again, the Russians have extended their gains north of Stepove. So, and also some small gains in the south around Vesele, so south meaning towards Avdiivka. Additionally, when we're looking at the south, the true south of Avdiivka, here close to Piske, the Russians also made some slight gains. You can see that a few days ago, the Russians have started a new push here, and they have gotten a little bit of ground here in the fields between Nevelske and Piske. And lastly, really at the very south of Donetsk city, the Russians have pretty much taken entirely the town of Marinka. You can see that a few days ago, the Ukrainians still had held the positions, about 5%. But now the Russians have taken completely the town of Marinka as well. Although, I must admit that Marinka is no more. It's not a city or a town that exists. There were several pictures that were released recently from this area, and it's just all pure rubble. So there's nothing really left of Marinka, unfortunately. So that's the situation right now in the Donetsk and Avdiivka area. So the Russians are really doing multiple pushes right now to really push the Ukrainian positions further away from their default capital of Donetsk. Furthermore, if we're looking at Bakhmut, unfortunately, the Russians are also pressing here. And I've mentioned in the past few videos that the Russians have taken back some positions close to Klishivka. And you can see that they have gotten a little bit more ground here as of the last few days. So they've just pushed a little bit forward in these kind of lower heights that are overlooking Klishivka. So unfortunately, the Russians are pushing here. And also in the north of Bakhmut, close to Krumove. Basically, the situation is the same since my last update, but the Russians are also trying to push to get closer to Chasiv Yar, which we've already talked about is an important city for the Ukrainians to resupply troops. It's an important staging area for the Ukrainians right now to keep a hold on Bakhmut or the suburbs of Bakhmut. Then let's go up north. So of course, there's a lot of activity close to Kremina, but right now the situation has been relatively the same for the last few months. The fighting is ongoing in the forests of Kremina. They're very dense forests, and both sides have a lot of men and a lot of defenses here, so it's difficult to make any big gains. So the situation is relatively the same here. And if we really go up north, so this is the Kupiansk offensive of the Russians. Recently, as of yesterday, the Russians have renewed an offensive towards Sinkivka, and this offensive failed. So the Russians threw about 5 armored vehicles, including some tanks, if I remember correctly, and they were ultimately destroyed by Ukrainian artillery and FPV drones. And so this entire attack was annihilated from the Ukrainian side, and today the Russians continued on pressing here with just infantrymen, which was interesting. So again, it shows that the Russians are really dedicated in also really taking a lot of ground in the north. And as I've said, it's mainly because of how close they are to the Russian-Ukrainian border. They can constantly resupply troops, move in, ammunition and other critical supplies to destabilize the Ukrainian forces here and to really keep a certain amount of Ukrainian forces in the north as well. So this serves also as kind of a distraction, I believe, for the Ukrainians, where, if we think about it, the Ukrainians could have utilized some of these forces that are currently defending the north in the Bakhmut direction or other directions that are more critical But that is not to say that this direction is not critical. Of course, due to the proximity of Kupiansk, the Ukrainians need to be holding positions here. So that's the main situation right now. In the east, there's one last update, again, that is not so positive, but that is in Robotine, so the Orikhiv axis direction. And you can see that a few weeks ago, the Ukrainians took the western positions of Robotine, some fields around here. You can see that the Russians have pushed and did a small counterattack here. You can see that they were able to push out the Ukrainians and kind of start squeezing them around Robotine. So and also push south of Robotine around Novoprokopivka. So overall, you can see that in all these different directions, whether they be in the south of Ukraine or in the east, the Russians have picked up the initiative and they're now counterattacking in several directions. What can I say about it? Of course, yes, we can say that one thing that is helping is that the Russians have brought 170,000 fresh troops in the last few months since the end of the summer, which has helped the Russians renew these new offensives. But I think there's also a lot of introspection that needs to be done. From what I've been hearing recently, some Ukrainian soldiers and analysts have been saying that what Ukraine is lacking right now is a multi-echelon defense throughout the entire front line. Right now, there's really only one defense, and if the Russians have a breakthrough somewhere, they can easily penetrate and go ahead about 2-3 kilometers without any issues. And so Ukraine has not been building these defenses that we've seen from the Russian side, especially in the Surovikin line. Admittedly, this Surovikin line has worked for the Russians because of how dense it was and the capabilities of the Russians to constantly resupply. With, the first line of defense was broken, then the Ukrainians need to fight at the second line of defense. And so the Russians are also moving a lot of reserves. And this complicates the situation for the Ukrainians, because where you would usually be able to break the first line of defense or the only one, then you pretty much have an open space to liberate a lot of ground and penetrate, dozens of kilometers, which is what we've seen in Kharkiv. The Russians only had one line of defense, the Ukrainians penetrated it, and afterwards it was pretty much chaos. That is not to say the Ukrainians just have one line of defense entirely on the entire front line, but like in directions like Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, the Ukrainians did not reinforce their positions, and when the Russians counterattacked, it wasn't enough to defend these areas like Krasnohorivka and the south of Avdiivka as well. Everything that is close to Piske, Marinka, the Ukrainians simply did not build these trenches, these very dense fortifications that would be enough to hold on to these massive Russian infantry attacks. And again, on a normal day, these types of constructions that the Ukrainians had would have been okay to hold on, normal Russian attacks. But now we've been seeing that the Russians are exclusively utilizing Zhukov attacks, meaning there is no issue with losing thousands of men per day, and the Russians are completely fine with that. And this is problematic because the Ukrainians simply are getting exhausted on several directions. So I think that there is some introspection that is necessary as well from the Ukrainian side, and that is not just the West isn't helping enough. The West isn't providing. I've seen a very big increase of help from Europe, especially in the last few weeks. So I think that it's not just the fact that Ukraine isn't receiving, the ammunition or the armored vehicles necessary to hold on to, let's say, Avdiivka or other key areas. So that is one thing. And again, as I've said, this is what's worked. This multi-echelon defense is what worked for the Russians in the south, admittedly. Right, the Ukrainians did get some success, but it was grinding success. Every single day the Ukrainians were fighting, meter by meter, because of this, the heavy amount of trenches and mines and defenses that the Russians had, and constantly pushing reserves to counterattack the Ukrainian gains. So I think the Ukrainians need to learn a little bit from the Russians, yes. And I think that only now, a few weeks ago, I mentioned that Zelensky proved the beginning of building these heavy fortifications in the north and the east and the south. So hopefully that can get done as quickly as possible and really settle and make the Ukraine positions as strong as possible against these massive zombie attacks that the Russians are throwing at the Ukrainians. So that is the update for the map, yeah, there's not that many good news, but again, the Ukrainians are capable of defending. If it wasn't for the heroism, the bravery of these Ukrainian soldiers, Avdiivka would have been lost by now. You know, the Ukrainians don't have a lot of trenches and solid fortifications, but because of the bravery, because of the ingenuity of the Ukrainian brigades, the 110th, the 47th Brigade right now fighting in Avdiivka, if it wasn't for that, Avdiivka would have been lost. So, you know, never discount the heart of Ukrainian soldier. They're doing some impossible tasks right now to hold on to these key cities. But I've already mentioned one key thing that Ukraine needs to be doing right now to make sure that, you know, the Bakhmuts and the Severodonetsk don't continue to be repeated. These types of situations don't continue to be repeated, you know, in multiple front lines. So reinforcing Ukrainian positions, building more trenches, and also doing multi-echelon defenses throughout the front line is extremely important, instead of relying on the same units over and over to fend off these Russian attacks. So let me know what you guys think about this comment that I just made about, you know, what Ukraine needs to do as well. A little bit of an introspection. Now, some very great news. So with all that, I bring you some great news. So yesterday, you know, the accession of Ukraine into the European Union has officially began. So the European Union voted in favor to start having talks to integrate Ukraine into the EU. So that is fantastic. And we know that the big elephant in the room was Orban in Hungary. So the president of Hungary, who was saying that he would block and veto this decision. But what was surprising is that they made this vote when he wasn't in the room. And so once he left the room, the voting took place. And because he wasn't there, his right of vetoing was removed, obviously. And so basically they approved. So this is just step number one of Ukraine, you know, starting the process of being part of the European Union, but is great nonetheless. And also Moldova, this tiny little country west of Ukraine, also was admitted into this accession. So the very first step. So there's a lot of work to do. But what was interesting is that it seems like this was done on purpose. So Orban knew that he was leaving the room and they would take the votes. So it wasn't like he just left the room not knowing what was going to happen. So that was interesting, what occurred yesterday, but fantastic news. Again, I cannot, you know, highlight the importance of this historic moment yesterday. Truly, this is what the Ukrainian people have been fighting, at least in its modern history, for the last 20 years, since the Orange Revolution. Ukraine, the majority of the Ukrainians, I'm not saying every single Ukrainian, but the majority of Ukrainians want to be part of Europe, of the European Union, and they want to be now aligned with Europe and the free world. The Russian experiment, or the Russian experience and its influence in Ukraine, has failed. Clearly, the Ukrainians no longer want this Russian influence and assistance anymore. And I think it's extremely historic. And this is step number one to officially, you know, give a middle finger to Russia. And I am just so happy because, again, as I've said, you know, the realistic situation now pinpoints that it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to regain the entire control of, you know, its lost territory from Russia. It's evident, right? The Russians have also doubled down with their defenses throughout the front line. They have mined the hell out of certain positions. And, you know, truly what we've seen in the summer counteroffensive is that, unfortunately, you know, Ukraine, with the current assets it doesn't have enough to be able to retake its territory completely in the next few years. And the only hope, I think, is when Russia completely crumbles from within, is when Ukraine will be able to take back all of these lost territories. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that it's become much harder now that Russia's had time to build up its massive defenses throughout the front line and also find new suppliers, right? China is now more aligned with Russia, providing weapons, or, you know, not lethal weapons, but critical components and gear for the Russian military. We have Iran providing drone technology. We have North Korea providing, you know, shells by the millions to Russia. So Russia has a lot of allies that can help them continue this war for many years. So unfortunately, this isn't going to be quick anymore if Ukraine hopes to take back its territory. You know, pre-February, at the very least pre-February 2022. But the optimistic, the best optimal scenario would be to have Ukraine take back all the oblasts and Crimea as well. But as I said, that possibility becomes less and less possible as time goes by. And, we know that time is of the essence. The Ukrainian forces had started their counteroffensive with the long-range missiles that were, supposedly promised, and the jet fighters. I think they would have had more of a fighting chance against the Russians. They would have surprised them in their military bases in Berdyansk and Melitopol. They would have struck key military field air bases and key logistical hubs of the Russians. And within a few days, the shock that the Russians would have had would really impact the ability of the Ukrainians to penetrate further and further in the south. But obviously, Ukraine did not have all the weapons, and it's also questionable whether it would have been able to pull off a combined arms operation as well. So, all that being said, I'm going back to the main topic, that it's great to hear that the European Union is welcoming Ukraine. Again, it's only step number one. There's a lot of work to do ahead. Again, I'm not very familiar with all the steps, but I imagine there's a lot of changes that need to be done within Ukraine, within the institutions, to make sure that they're aligned as much as possible with European values and European structures. We know that, unfortunately, Ukraine still has a massive, Soviet legacy that roams in Ukraine, whether it be in its political institutions, its economic institutions, its military institutions. There still is a Soviet mentality present, and that needs to be completely removed, or at least, the majority of these beliefs need to be erased, and new ideas, new mentalities, new values need to be brought to these institutions. So there's a lot of work to do, and that's going to take a lot of time, but it's good to see that Ukraine now has achieved step number one. And there's another step to achieve, which is NATO. NATO is extremely important. Ukraine needs to be part of NATO. If Ukraine is part of NATO and European Union, then I believe, yes, if the situation remains unchanged, meaning that neither side can get any ground, and essentially it's become more of a stalemate, then I think that in the peace talks, Ukraine comes with a lot of cards in its hand, very powerful cards. And, it will make Russia think twice when, let's say, these peace talks are concluded, agreed upon. Russia won't be able to pull off, or will think twice to pull off, another invasion like what we saw with Minsk I, Minsk II, and even the Budapest Memorandum, which should have guaranteed no invasion whatsoever in Ukraine, but yet it happened, and everybody just turned around and pretended that nothing happened in Crimea and Luhansk and Donbass and Donetsk. But, the fact that Ukraine eventually would be part of NATO and European Union would force the Russians to not pull off this type of invasion again. Not saying that it would never happen, but Putin would be more careful with his actions, knowing that he's attacking a NATO member, right? And I think that's very true. We can say all we want, what we think of Putin, but I think that he's still a rational person at this point. And he wants to continue, having his regime exist. That's why he's not directly attacking, NATO countries, because he now understands that he doesn't have the force, the manpower to even, defeat one of these NATO countries, whether it be Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. There's a lot of, dreaming going on in Moscow, but I'm sure that Putin understands what it would mean to attack Finland, Estonia, and they might get their asses kicked. So I think that Ukraine being part of the European Union and NATO would severely detract Russia from pulling off another massive scale invasion. So this is more of a pragmatic approach that I'm giving you guys. And the good news as well is that following the succession, the European Union also quickly approved $1.5 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine. So this is just a quick help to help things continue, working as intended within the Ukraine government and the Ukraine society. So that is also excellent. And, there's also talks, although blocked by Hungary, by the European Union, to give $50 billion of aid eventually to Ukraine in the next few, I believe, years, or the next year. But unfortunately, Orban, being, the pro-Russian that he is, obviously vetoed it. So that is unfortunate. He is one of the biggest, let's say, obstacles right now for the European Union, because obviously they don't want to kick out Hungary out of the European Union. It would just entice Russia to then, swallow Hungary or influence Hungary to be more pro-Russian. And obviously you don't want to be punishing a society just for one bad government. It's not fair. So, but they need to find mechanisms to remove the right of vetoing within certain countries that have governments that are simply not aligned with the European Union, whether it be with its politics, with its institutions, with corruption. I think that there needs to be new mechanism found in place to remove these sort of loopholes that these pro-Russian countries often can find in order to stop the aid for Ukraine. So that's the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed my updates. I've talked about a lot of things. Yeah, some things are more negative, but that is the reality of war. It's never going to be always good or always bad. Ukraine had some victories, Ukraine had some defeats, and the same for Russia. And let's not forget again who Ukraine is fighting against. We can make fun all we want against Russia, against Russia, saying that look at these schmobiks, these conscripts, these prisoners, look how poor they look and they have barely any ammunition. They're being sent out to the front lines, but it's a massive army. It's a massive power that Ukraine is currently defending. And it's also kind of belittling all the efforts, all the bravery that these Ukrainian soldiers are pulling off every single day. Right? They're not fighting against some small little, country that has barely any tanks and any, ammunition. It's against Russia, which has been stockpiling weapons since the Cold War. And it has plenty of that. And it has some very, very strong allies that don't, hover around the topic of should we support Russia? Should we not support Russia? They're absolutely all in. Whether it be Iran, China, North Korea, it's in their interest to destabilize the free world. Whereas Ukraine right now, we're seeing a lot of tiptoeing, whether it be from the United States, where the Republicans don't want to pass the bill, or the majority of Republicans that don't want to be, passing this bill that will provide $60 billion of aid to Ukraine, or within Europe, all these divisions, whether it be Slovakia or Hungary or, Austria, Switzerland, working more towards the interests of Russia, that's the issue also for Ukraine. The fact that it can't really rely all the time on its partners because it doesn't know what they're going to think tomorrow. They might just decide to pressure Ukraine to a peace treaty. They might say, sorry, you're not going to NATO, or you're not going to the European Union. And so we're discounting the bravery that the Ukrainian soldiers are pulling off to make sure that this happens. Without that, the first month Ukraine would have fallen. Without all these Ukrainian soldiers fighting so hard to defend their territory, defending what is rightfully theirs. So I hope you guys enjoyed my video today. I talked about a lot of things, so let me know what you think about any of these topics that I covered today. Your comments are always welcome. I heard you loud and clear for a live stream, so I will most likely set up one for Tuesday, so next week in the evening. So let me know if that is interesting to you, if you're going to be present for Tuesday. And a huge thank you for support for this channel. Please leave me a like if you enjoy my content, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini!